So we're back here with Josip today, and we're going to be talking about the NSL. Josip, can you just introduce yourself really quickly?
Yeah, sure. My name's Josip Lončarić. I'm a school teacher currently and a coach at Downs College. Also with the soccer school program, as you can see with the banners behind me. And yeah, I'm still playing actively, sort of getting towards the end of my career. I'll be 37 later this month, so the legs are not moving as they once were. Yeah. And I guess I've had the pleasure of being in the old era with the NSL in my youth involvement in soccer, and then also seeing the growth and the continual rise, I guess, of the A-League and the way that new football, if you want to call it that, is being played at the moment.
Yeah. Just really quickly, just really briefly, who is your favourite club and player back in that era?
So growing up as a kid of Croatian background, the club of choice was the Melbourne Knights, and we'd obviously also follow Sydney United, being the other Croatian club in the National League. Yeah. But as a kid going down to Summer Street and watching the Knights play, before all the grandstands were built and what you see now of that club with the lights and everything. I remember being there for the first game where they turned the lights on. That was against Sydney United. Yeah. As a young kid, and playing my juniors at Melbourne Knights as well. Yes. And then you had the opportunity, obviously, to look up to these guys and watch them week in, week out, and learn from them, live in the stand, and see them in the social club afterwards. Yeah. I guess that was probably the one of the biggest things about the NSL. You kind of felt a little bit closer to those players day to day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. I know that you mentioned you played as a junior, and I also know that you were trialling at South at one stage.
Yeah, so I played juniors at Melbourne Knights, and then managed to get myself into the National Youth League team, which I think back then was under 21s, and I was a 15, turning 16-year-old. So playing for the Knights for the youth team was something surreal as a kid. You obviously wanted to emulate your heroes, and I guess. One of those things as a youth player back then was you'd actually get to play with some of the senior boys. So, for example, if a guy was coming back from an injury, because the youth league was structured in the way that the youth game was before the senior game, you could actually play that youth game, and afterwards you'd watch the senior game. So if there were players that were coming back from injury, so one of my perfect role model players that I used to look at as a young kid was Adrian Savinski, who came back from an injury once and had to play in a youth game up front, and I was a young striker then. Yeah. I got to play up front with an Adrian Savinski, who you appreciate that he was a really good finisher as a young kid watching the game, and as young kids we kind of just look at goals and actions in the game. But when you play up front with someone of that caliber, you realise how much work he does off the ball and movement off the ball to create space for you.
Oh, yes.
For a young kid growing up, I mean, one of my coaches at the time was Luciano Trani, who's a phenomenal coach and was well ahead of his time back in the days at Melbourne Knights. And he would go through video analysis and explain things to us, and he did the best he could. But for me, there was no better experience than when you're playing alongside someone. You get an education for 90 minutes that you'd never get in a training session.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, and play, look, guys like that occasionally, guys like Ivan Kelic later on, guys, when you're a little kid, you look up to them and you chant their name behind the goals, and you want to be a ball boy at the club just so you can throw the ball to them during the game for a throw-in or a corner, and celebrate with them when they score their goal. That was obviously the thing for me. And as a kid watching the NSL, like my favourite player was Mark Viduka. Yeah. And you got to see, a 17-year-old break it into the senior team and score a heap of goals, win the Johnny Warren medal, win the Young Player of the Year, the top goal scorer, and then head off overseas. And I guess a lot of his transfer money helped build the new grandstand that they built afterwards and named after him, and sales of other players, and that helped grow that club from a really small, ethnic club to a powerhouse in the old NSL.
Yeah. And just touching on that, that on-field experience that you mentioned and learning on the game from someone like that. That must have been something else.
Oh, just different level, and it wasn't even the fact that I know those guys had come down just to get match fitness. It wasn't their job to mentor and guide us, but some of them were really good at it. Yep. Some weren't so good. Some, as a senior player, I can imagine it wouldn't be easy to come down and play in a youth game with 15, 16, 17-year-olds And some would see it as a punishment because they're dropped for form, or others would be coming back from a suspension and have to serve their time. But generally, around the club, it was really good, like at Melbourne Knights, because the youth team, our changing would be just up the hall from the seniors. We'd be training in the afternoons, and in the evenings, and they'd be training as well. So they'd be on the main pitch, we'd be on the second one. And then sometimes you'd get called into a training game onto the main pitch, and you'd go and get 20 minutes playing against, senior players that are fighting for a position to play in an NSL game, which was the highest level of football soccer that we had back then. So that's very different, I think, to now. I mean, I see how the Victory and the City youth systems work. I don't think the senior players get to play with the youth teams, definitely not in the NPL system. And because the youth league's so short and it doesn't coincide with the actual A-League, they don't get that interaction. And I think it's something that's really lacking, because think of it as a young apprentice going out to a job site, for example, as a carpenter, and you don't learn everything from the book and from your course and from your prehab. You actually learn a lot from those experienced guys that teach you some little tricks. And I guess in that time as well, coming out when the NSL I was in my 20s when the NSL folded and there was that little gap for the A-League to start. A lot of the guys ended up playing in the VPL against us and with us. And that was surreal too, because I remember like one of my best football lessons was against Sash Oganovsky, playing in midfield in a preseason game. And it was the last game before the season starts. So everyone's fighting for positions, and Sash, being Sash, very competitive guy. And again, someone I watched at Melbourne Knights as a young kid and looked up to, just because he was so tough and uncompromising as a defender. Then he's playing central midfield against me in a game where I think the first touch I got, I kind of turned past him and I managed to get past him and play off a nice little ball, and I felt really good about myself. And he had some choice words to say in my ear about, young punk, watch yourself, something like that. But the next time the ball came, he made sure that his body took my body out of the contest, and I was rattled, and I didn't deal with it well at the time as a young player. I actually went into my shell, and I'm pretty sure I got subbed at halftime in that game and missed my chance to start in the first round of the season because I'd bottled it basically against a really big, strong-bodied, top professional having to play in a semi-pro league with us. And he taught me a lesson that day. And the beautiful thing about that is last year at the Croatian Cup in Dandenong City, Sash was playing in the final for Dandy City over 35s, and I was playing with my mate's team, the Gorspic Bears. They're over 35s, and we got to play against each other, and they ended up winning the final 2-0. And I saw Sash on the way out, and I had a bit of a chat with him about this, and I thanked him for it because to him it was just another little kid that was playing against him, and he just had to show that there's a reason why he's played at the level that he's played and why I've played at the level I've played. And I just said to him that day, I go, you won't remember it, mate, but you absolutely monstered me on the next 2 tackles after I turned you, and I thought I was clever, and I was actually frightened of you in the sense of I didn't really want the ball anymore because I figured that you're going to put me over the fence the next tackle. So he just sort of giggled, and he's a smashing guy off the field, And that's what you find, I guess, with a lot of these guys is they've, on the field that they teach you that lesson about that white line fever, and when you're on the field, it's really about the performance and what do you have to do to your opponent to actually psych him out and win the game. I mean, we've all heard stories of Roy Keane and these top players in the Premier League that, can stand toe-to-toe. The Keane Vieira is a fascinating documentary and that played out on the field for a decade nearly between Arsenal and Man United. But we had those characters here in Australia, and there's other little things that you'd learn from these guys. So I remember playing with Marcus Sturgopoulos, who played at Carlton. And Marcus was really pedantic about warm-up laps. The old coaches used to send you for the couple of warm-up laps, and people would cut corners. And Marcus would have a go at people that cut corners. And I thought to myself at the time, why is he doing that? It's just a warm-up. But that's the standards that he set. He also wore his socks up with shin pads at training, even in the warm-up. And I asked him the question while we were stretching, because by then I was sort of in my mid-20s, and he was coming towards the end of his career like I am now. And when young kids ask me questions, I'm always happy to have that conversation. And I said to him, why do you do that? And he goes, are you going to play with shin pads on the weekend? And I said, yeah. He goes, so why wouldn't you train with them so you get used to the tightness around your calves and you don't cramp up? So there's logic behind it. So, you know, these are those little things. And I think you mentioned it before about having the opportunity to train at South. I was actually in year 12 at the time, and South had just come back from the World Club Championship, so they'd gone full time, and Eddie Kimchevich was the coach, and I had the opportunity to come and trial and train with their first team at Albert Park, and that was surreal as well, because these guys had just played against Man United in Brazil, you know, and now you're training with them, and like I remember even in training sessions, guys like Trimboli, who I always thought he was really clever as a player, watching him play against the Knights as a Knights fan, and when he was playing for South. But when you played with him, the little passes and the creativity that he'd give you, he made it, like I could score 10 or 15 goals at a training session. And it was all him, you know, just making me look good. I make the run, he delivers the pass. Whereas when you play with youth players of your own age, sometimes they're not at that level yet. They haven't had that experience. So you might make the right run, but that ball never arrives. And they're those little lessons that you learn from these top players. And I mean, at the time, Eugene Galekovic was coming through. He was a young guy, just a couple of years older than me, and he was fighting for a spot. I was not at their level, obviously, but I was, you know, close enough to have an opportunity to train with them for 3-4 weeks. But I couldn't stick to full time, obviously, with VCE. My parents wouldn't have that. And to be fair, I don't think I was at that level, and it was proven in my history I didn't reach the NSL level as a player. So, but from those lessons, from what I learned, and now when I get to reflect on that, I think to myself, wow, how lucky I was to play and train with these sort of players back then.
On the same night, the lucky Queensland fans were...
You have to appreciate that at the time, that was the best we had in the country in terms of a competition. And the game hadn't really taken off to the level that it has now, in the sense of, you know, junior participation was predominantly the ethnic families and kids that had come from countries where football was the biggest sport, soccer was the biggest sport. But, you know, one thing that sort of... I actually went to the first A-League game, the first derby game between Sydney FC and Melbourne Victory, and that was at the old Olympic Park, where I used to go and watch the Melbourne Knights in finals and things. And I remember sitting in that ground, and it was a sellout, 18,000-19,000, and I sat in the game as a journalist at the time, working for Goal Weekly, just covering, you know, doing some freelance journalism. And I thought to myself, I watched the game. It was a 5-0 win. Archie Thompson tore it up. You know, crowd was buzzing, and I looked around, and it was really good to see. Like, there was people of, if I looked around the shoulders, I would say at least maybe 5 or 6 different nationalities all cheering for the one team, and that was a fantastic thing. And that was what I wrote. That was my main point of that article, about the fact that, you know, this league can unite us all. But at the same time, I think forgetting what had happened in the past was to the detriment of the sport, because the Melbourne Knights, the South Melbourne's, just from our part of, you know, the Gippsland Falcons, who many young kids would never have even heard of. But as a young kid, they had guys like John Markovski, a guy I played with at Western Suburbs, who just phenomenal player, like, you know, the touch and the understanding, the left foot. These are the things that you can't appreciate if you didn't get to watch them. And you can go on YouTube and find highlights of these guys, but watching them and training with them and seeing the level they had. And that's without everything that's now given to our players, you know, the professionalism, the fact that there is a pro league where you can earn a full-time living doing what you love, with the sports science and all the perks that come of being a professional. That's here. But these guys used to work, you know, they used to have day jobs, you know, and play then in the top competition. And a lot of them would go overseas from that, you know, and make careers over in Europe. So I think we have to appreciate what we had. And obviously the game had to evolve in this country, and it has evolved. And I think the FFA Cup was a good way for them to try and keep the lives of these ethnic clubs, you know, the ones that founded the game in the country, keep them alive. But I think there can always be more, you know, maybe not in our time, but maybe in 40, 50 years' time, they will have multiple divisions. We'll have a full promotion relegation system where, if they're that ambitious, if you're South Melbourne's, your Melbourne Knights, if they're that ambitious to go to that level, then they've got the opportunity. And I think that's a really important thing for us to remember, is you don't want to, if someone's that ambitious, leave the door open for them to let them try and reach that potential that they once had. Because it was when you were a kid and you went to Melbourne Knights and that place was filled, you know, the derby, 12, 15,000 people, South and Knights, they were crazy. They were crazy fun times as a kid. And a little bit of that's lost because, again, it's hard for me now to jump ship. That's a club I supported as a little kid, and go and support an A-League team with the same level of passion, because that's not what I grew up with as a youngster. But hopefully in time, these young kids that have had, exposure to City, Victory, now Western United, they can form that same sort of level of passion. I guess it's up to those clubs then to see how they can engage and create a closeness with the community.
Well said there, man. Well said.
Easy. And you won't get any games like the 3-2 game between South and Melbourne Knights before the final, where it was raining like all day, torrential rain. And we were our junior team then, under 14s or whatever. We went to play South at half time, like a little bit of like they do with the mini roos now.
Yeah.
And they put us as ball boys, and that's all we could do because the pitch was that waterlogged. But the ball did not move. But they let the game go because it had to be done so that the winner could play Adelaide City the next week in Adelaide. And I think Konbutsiana scored 2, Viduka scored 3.
Yeah.
It was a massive crowd, and it was bucketing down all day. And it was such a great experience, I mean, as a youngster, to see your team reach the final, and they ended up winning it the next week up in Adelaide. So, these days that game would have been called off, although the drainage is probably a lot better these days at Amy Park than it was back then. So, these are those memories that you have as a kid, and hopefully, we'll recreate things like that in the future with the A-League as people develop a bond with their team and a real connection to their club.
So I've just looked up that game, and that South Melbourne 3-2 94-95 final.
Yep.
Just looking at the waterlogged pitch, you can tell.
Yeah. Danny Tiato got a red card in the first 10 minutes. Knights had to play with 10 men.
Yeah.
These are the things I can remember these games vividly because as a kid, when you grew up, that's what you loved,
Oh yeah.
And I remember Frank Arrock during the week saying Viduka's not up to it. He's overrated.
Yeah.
And Viduka scores his hat trick and runs up to Arrock and gives him the hands up. But this was great. This was the banter, and it was low key. It wasn't on the front page of the Herald Sun. Now the derbies, the derbies would get that kind of coverage. When it's not conflicting with AFL, as we know, but they'd get that kind of coverage. You wouldn't get that in the old Herald Sun. So it was all the talk at the school the next day between the Knights supporters and the South supporters about who won and why they won and who's in the final. And so there's some great classic things for kids to watch from the old NSL. And a lot of our top Socceroos came out of that system. They made it from here. They got their break in that league, and then they moved on to bigger and better things in Europe. But a lot of them are still very fond of their time in the NSL and their the attachment to their boyhood clubs, as you heard with the Socceroos when they spoke on Optus a few months ago.
Mm.